Good morning. Nice to see so many people here for the Lahore Literature Festival. And I know that you're all here to hear Rick Stroud. We thank Rick for coming from London. Rick Stroud is a filmmaker and a writer based in London. And in the past 8 years, he has published 8 books, which makes him a very prolific writer, really. Yes. And his latest book, Lonely Courage, is the topic of our discussion today. And Lonely Courage is the book, the true story of 6 women spies who worked in World War II and fought against the Germans in Nazi-occupied France. And for the purposes of the hour, we'll talk about 3 of these women, our favorite spy princess, Noor Inayat Khan, being the top of them. And I'll begin the session by asking Rick, what made him write this book, a World War II story, based specifically on the women spies who were working in the war?
Well, I've always been very interested in the Second World War, and I'm a sort of soldier monkey. If I hadn't gone to Oxford, I would have joined the army. But when I was about 11 years old, there's a comic in England called The Eagle, which ran a serial based on the life of one of these women, SOE women, called Violette Szabo. And that series was called Carve Her Name with Pride. And it was a sort of largely fictitious account of a real woman who I write about. And that got me interested, and her name stuck in my head. And then as I went on, I'm a filmmaker, and I've done various television series set in the war. One of them was about a woman in the SOE called Diana, which was a completely fictitious thing, but a lot of what happened in it is based in truth. And as I went on, I used to make lists of the things I wanted to write about, and I found, I'm 70 now, and I was 10 when I first got hold of the SOE. I found that I found more other interesting women like Noor Khan. In fact, I read in one book about the SOE that there was the grave of, or a plaque to, an Indian princess who was in the SOE somewhere near Harrods. And I once spent a week trying to find the plaque that celebrated Noor Khan. I never did find it, although it is there, and I have now seen it 30 years after that week-long search. And so more and more I thought, well, I'd like to write about them, but they're all so interesting, they're all so brave. There were 40 of them in all, I think, and 13 of them died, and quite a large proportion of the rest of them suffered so badly through being imprisoned or just through the stress of being a spy that they never really recovered. And then when I finished, I wrote a book about the camouflage unit in the Western Desert and was looking for another subject. And I thought, well, I talked to my agent, and I thought, well, why don't I try and write a book about several of these women and use, say, I thought 10 or 3 or 4, I ended up with 6, and use them as the lens with which to look through and at the bravery of these women and try and explain their lives through those 6 women. And so I settled on the 6, and Noor was one, and Noor Khan, and I'll explain why towards the end of this session, but Noor Khan's bravery set a moral bar that we have to live up to today, and I'll explain what I mean by that, as I say, later on when we get there. But so that's how I got to writing about a group of them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And some of the people in the audience, when they came in this morning and we were still here, were saying that they've come to this session because they're so fascinated by World War II stories. And they said our whole generation has probably grown up in the subcontinent as well, seeing films and reading about the World War. And they wanted to hear more. And strangely enough, actually, Rick, that the women spies were less talked about, and it took kind of almost 70 years and that too for Western writers to talk about and celebrate the women spies. I know we had Shrabani Basu's book, but she's also a British writer, to celebrate an Indian princess a descendant of none less than Tipu Sultan, the 18th century rulers of Mysore, whose father was a Sufi Muslim and mother was an American. She was born in Moscow and went on to live in France and London. And for her to become an SOE agent for the British Army at the tender age of 29. So congratulations to you to bring out these stories and come back to Lahore and narrate them to us on the subcontinent.
I mean, the point about Noor was, as you said, she was a princess. Her mother was American. Her father was a Sufi mystic, I think that's right. And all she wanted to do was write children's books and create music. And she was a very, very gentle, pacifist person. And her father said, "You must never tell a lie." And when she was being trained, one of the trainers said, "You'll never guess what that father of hers has said. She must never tell a lie," which meant that even if she was captured and interrogated, she must never tell a lie. And they had to find a way that she could be interrogated, were that to happen, and it did happen, and it was terrible. She could be interrogated without some lying. And I can't remember the exact philosophical shift that they sort of put into her head, but it worked.
I think it was almost the passion, from your book, what I gather, it was almost the passion for the work she was doing, fighting for the Allied forces. And
yeah, no, I mean, so she turned her desire to, she wrote children's stories. She was a bestseller of children's stories, but I can't emphasize this enough. She was very, very gentle, and after she was captured, they said she's one of the most dangerous spies in Europe. And for 9 months she was kept in solitary confinement. She was categorized as being a night and fog prisoner, which means that whatever happened to them, they would gradually, I don't know what the German word is, but the idea is that they would disappear into the mist. And they had, on their cards, when they were sent off to the prisons, they had night and fog written on the card, no return required. So they did not care what happened to the night and fog prisoners. And Noor Khan was a night and fog prisoner. And once she got to the cell where she was going to be kept for the rest of her life, she was kept in a horrible, almost naked. She was chained to the floor. She was allowed to wash just about once a week. And she was given the most basic, disgusting food. And she was kept in solitary confinement. And people used to say, we know, other prisoners would say, we know there's an agent in there. We don't know what's going on. We can hear her crying. We can hear her being beaten. And eventually Noor scratched something on the bottom of the tin cup plate that she was given. These plates were given with food, and then they were taken back. And obviously other people got the same plate. And so she wrote, "I'm a British agent," on the bottom of the plate. And another prisoner saw this, and so there was a sort of very rudimentary communication with Noor. And at one point she said, "I am so unhappy." And on another occasion she wrote, I wish my mother was with me." So, you can tell how much she suffered from those things. And just the fact that they could hear her crying and being beaten day after day. A gentle 29-year-old should not have been treated like that, but she never cracked. She never gave away what she knew, but she was tormented. Do you think we should just talk a bit about the start of the SOE?
Yes, that's what I was going to ask you next. But that's fine. You can continue that. Just for the purposes of explaining. So, what was the SOE, and how was it organized, and to help fight the resistance?
Churchill said at the beginning of the war, "We must set Europe ablaze," and one of the things that he did to enable that to happen was he formed the commandos who would be landed on the shore of France, but he also formed the Special Operations Executive, which was to send agents into the various occupied countries of Europe, all of which had become information black holes, and nobody knew what was going on. And France was obviously the most important one, and the SOE was run by a lot of very patrician, paternalistic men. And they thought that women had their place in all of this, but obviously what women should be doing is the typing, fetching the tea, helping the men get on. And then there was one day the man who was recruiting the agents for F section, which was the French section, said, "I think that women would be much better spies than these men, and I want to look for them and recruit them." And the Gubbins, who was running it, General Gubbins, who was running the SOE, said, no, women, they have their place, but it's not as agents. And Selwyn Jepson said, no, I really believe this. No, old boy, just trust us. We know we shouldn't be having women. It would be utterly wrong to send them into action. And eventually Jepson got himself in front of Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, and he said, "Prime Minister, I think that women have a cool and lonely courage," and that's where I got the title of the book from. He said, "They have a cool and lonely courage, which means that they would be better at this job. They're better at being on their own. Men like to be with men. Women don't. They can become invisible. That's what we want, is people who are invisible. May I start recruiting them?" And Churchill looked at him and said, "Yes, good luck." And off Selwyn Jepson went to recruit the women, and he looked for anybody who could speak French, which meant people like Violette Szabo, who's another person I wrote about, like Noor, who'd been brought up in France or who had French parents. The problem with saying I want fluent French speakers is it's very, very difficult to speak spy-level French. However good your French, you've only got to make a tiny, and you're in an environment which is out to get you, and the whole of France was inhabited by Gestapo agents, French milice who were collaborating police, collaborators themselves, and they were all looking for trouble. And if they saw an agent, or if they saw a person who was behaving very, very slightly wrong, wearing the wrong coat, whose buttons were sewn slightly oddly, who drank wine in a slightly peculiar way, that would make them a suspicious person. They would be then hounded until they were found out. And that's, with Noor, that didn't happen actually, because she was betrayed much earlier on. But she was in an environment whereby it was impossible to relax. And if you left this room, or even sitting in this room, imagine that you're an agent. Imagine that you don't know who's a policeman here, or who's a Gestapo agent. You've got to be very, very careful. You cannot relax. Your stomach is clenched 24 hours a day. It's a very stressful environment to be in. Imagine walking out of here, there's a person out there, you can't recognize them, but they're looking for agents. How do you behave? And women, jolly good, they're quite capable of just sort of blending into the background.
So through the book we see how these women, 40 of them in all, we've chosen the 6 favorite ones in the book, but the 40 women, how they actually almost did better than the men spies. And first their bravery, and they managed to escape at times and almost become invisible on occasions where men would have stood out much more. And there are 2 instances in the book here that you write, that how Noor was stopped by the Gestapo police on 2 occasions when she was putting down the aerial of a transmitter. So she was basically a transmitter operator. That was her position.
She was a radio operator.
Yes. And she had a very tall aerial to her radio, and she was bringing it down when one of the Gestapo police stopped her. And she managed to convince him that no, it's just some sort of other...
It's a clothesline, I think she said. Don't worry, it's a clothesline.
Yeah, she convinced him it's some sort of aerial to some clothes.
And another time she was stopped, and she had her radio transmitter with her, and one of the elements of the radio transmitter are crystals that you put in, and a policeman opened it and said, "What's this?" And she said, "Oh, it's a projector for the cinema." And the man believed her. That sort of thing went... Yes. On and on. But what betrayed Noor was that the SOE was very, very badly run by the 3 people in London who were in command, a man called Maurice Buckmaster, a man called Boddington, and a woman called Vera Atkins. And Buckmaster was a car salesman who'd worked in France. And he had no idea about command. And there was a point when they were trying to send in agents either by parachute or by Lysander aeroplane. And these are tiny little aeroplanes that land. And the Royal Air Force, who were operating these aeroplanes, said, we are getting fed up because whenever we land these aeroplanes, there isn't a proper reception committee. We're risking our men and our equipment, our highly trained pilots and our equipment, and they get captured, or there's nobody there. We're wasting our time, we're wasting petrol, etc., etc., etc. And the same thing's happening with the parachutists, that they land, there's either nobody there or the Germans are there. We need a man on the ground who can organize all this. And so they looked for somebody, and they found a guy called Henri Dericourt, who was a French test pilot who'd been, he'd sort of been freelancing in the south of France after the Germans had invaded, and nobody quite knew what he was, but he was a very good airman. And they recruited him, and at that point, one of the people in London, Vera Atkins, said, I don't trust this man, Dericourt. As soon as I met him, they'd flown him to London to interview him. She said, as soon as I met him, I thought there's something wrong with him. And Buckmaster, who was in charge with the aid of Boddington, who was his second in command, said, no, he's a very, very good chap. In fact, he's a first-class chap. And MI6 said, are you sure? We're getting a very, very bad reports about him. No, I'm absolutely certain that he's the man we want. So they employed this guy to be in France and to arrange the reception committees, some of which he would be at himself. And what they didn't know was that Boddington was already working for the Gestapo. He was a paid Gestapo agent with a Gestapo number, and we know that because we've seen the Gestapo records with his number on it. So he is flown back to France. He's now there when the agents land, and who's the first agent that he is responsible for? It's Noor Khan. She lands straight into France. He arranges for her to have a bicycle, and she bicycles off. She doesn't know that she's now being followed every inch of the way. They know she's there. They know what she's doing. And another thing that Dericourt does is that when the agents send back papers, which have got information, spy information, but they also send back letters to their loved ones. And Noor would send back letters to her mother, and her mother was a very important person in her life. Before those letters got to London, they were photographed by the Gestapo, so that when the prisoners were captured, they'd say, well, we know all about you. Look, here's the letter you sent to your mother. Here's the place that you were trained at. And that if you're now a prisoner with no idea of whether you'll get away with it, whether you're going to be released, that's a very demoralizing and difficult thing. So Noor Khan has already been given away when she arrives.
Yeah, Noor writes, when you write about her, that she was a writer of children's books as a young lady when she was in Paris. She graduated from the Sorbonne University, and she wrote about children's stories about the life of a young Buddha, the Jataka tales. She translated them into French. And one of the main characters in that is her hero, is this person who brings light to the world and taking punishment on himself. And she almost willed herself to live that life from there on.
Unwittingly, yes, she did. I mean, they're about people who struggle, who face darkness and endure terrible suffering themselves. And so unwittingly, before the war, Noor was writing about her own, what would happen to her, her own future. And just to go on about the SOE itself, another element of what happened was that before Noor arrived, there was a female agent who was genuinely French, who'd started up with a Polish officer who was sort of trapped inside France, who started the biggest spy network there was, called Inter Alliés, before any Allied agents were parachuted in. She was detected by a man called Hugo Bleicher, who was a very clever sergeant in the Abwehr, the intelligence, and he had been a carpet salesman before the war, but somehow he had the knack of seeing who was a spy and sort of breaking them, and he masqueraded as a colonel, and he detected that this woman, who was called Mathilde Carré, was was operating a big circuit. He arrested her. He put her the night of her arrest, and she knows hundreds of agents in Paris and northern France. The night of her arrest, he put her in a terrible prison. She was screamed at. She was sort of threatened. The prison cell that she was in stank of urine, and she was a good time girl. She liked to have a nice time, and she said by the end of that evening, all I wanted was my fur coat back. And then the next day, he took her to his office where he gave her fresh coffee, croissant, treated her very well, and said, "You've got a choice here. You can either work for me, or you can, or you'll be tortured and executed. It's up to you." And she folded up on the spot and said, "I'll work for you." The next night, she drove him round to meet some of the key agents. And when they opened the door, they said, "Ah, Mathilde, it's you." And they were immediately arrested, and they never knew why, because their friend had betrayed them. That's how dangerous it was. And they got, through Mathilde, they got all the sort of radio keys, and they began to transmit false information to London. One of the women that was arrested in that first night was called Madame Hugentobler, and she had a baby. And she said, "But what will happen to my baby?" And Bleicher said, "Madam, France will look after your baby." And that night, whilst Mathilde Carré became Bleicher's mistress, Madame Hugentobler hanged herself. So that's how serious the stakes were. I mean, it wasn't a question of putting up with being in a prisoner of war camp and trying to dig tunnels. You would be tortured and killed, and that's what Noor had to put up with. And the whole of the SOE French section had really been penetrated by initially the influence of this Mathilde Carré, and by the fact that she gave away the radio codes and they were able to transmit to London. Another element of this is that Buckmaster, not only had he employed a Gestapo agent to run his operations in France, but he would, if you were an agent and you were parachuted in and you were captured, you had two things you had to do. If you were forced to transmit false information to England, you had what was called a false code and a real code. And if you omitted your false code, that meant nothing at all, but it was something that you could pretend to the Germans that it was a special code that you had to put in. But if you omitted your real code, it meant, "I am operating under duress, do not trust anything that I say." And there was an agent, it wasn't Noor, but there was an agent who was parachuted in. He was immediately captured, and he transmitted, omitting his real code. And Buckmaster said to him, but almost by return over the radio, "You have omitted your real code, be more careful in future," which immediately gave the whole game away to the German intelligence. They knew about the real code, the false code, they knew how SOE was operating, they got to know a lot about it. So that, poor Noor, who was sent in without having finished her radio training into the most dangerous area at that time of France, which was Paris, really didn't have a chance. And she managed to survive for, I think, 2 or 2.5 months before she was captured. And she got more and more desperate and tried more and more disguises. And if you remember what I said to you, that the agents, the key to being an agent is to be invisible. Don't make yourself. Noor was dark-skinned. She tried to make herself look light-skinned. She wore different colored wigs, and she even at one point wore a red hat. And she was such a sweet person that she would, if she saw somebody that she knew, had known in Paris from her days before the war, she would wave at them and go hello. And because that's what you must not do, is wave at people and go hello. Because somebody will spot you doing that. Sorry.
No, that's right. And considering that she was dark-skinned and she must have stood out in Paris.
She did.
She was probably, interesting that they chose her to go as a spy, because probably anybody who looked at her once would recognize her right away the next time. Like, it must have been harder for her to blend in into
It was very hard. And people in London, when they heard that she was going to be sent in without a proper, fulfilled, completed training, said, "Please don't send her." And one of the men who was training her said, "Once scene never forgotten. She was very, very beautiful. That was the other thing, that she had this lovely sort of luminous quality about her, and her black hair. You couldn't help but notice her, and her essential gentleness and loveliness.
But she went on to be one of the bravest of the spy princesses. But Rick, you beautifully intertwine the different experiences of the various agents that you write about. And you talk about Christine Grenville,
Oh, yeah.
the Polish aristocrat, who had a completely different way that she dealt with her espionage.
Christine Granville was a very, very sexy Polish countess. She was about 27, and any man who met her used to fall for her. And when she heard that Poland had fallen, she immediately went to London and volunteered to be of any use. And Poland was the first place to turn into a black hole when no information was coming out. And Hitler had said, we're going to Poland to thrash the Jews. I mean, there was no doubt about what they were up to. And they even scrawled that in chalk on the side of the carriages taking the troops in. And Christine was a great skier, and she pleaded to be allowed to go to Poland. So they said, okay, you can. And they sent her first of all to Hungary to establish herself and to find a guide to take her over the Tatra Mountains. She met in Hungary a man who had won the Polish version of the VC. He immediately fell in love with her, and she became his mistress. And he said, you can't cross those mountains in the winter, it's too dangerous. And she said, I'm going to. And she was so strong and willful that she made him do what she wanted. Whilst she was in Hungary, senior officers would stand up when she came into a room. One man was so besotted with her that he said, if you don't become my mistress, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to castrate myself with my revolver. And he tried to do that. And of course he missed and shot himself in the foot. And then this man wouldn't give up. And he said, right, hobbling along, he said, I'm still going. And so he tried to drown himself by jumping in the Danube. And he'd forgotten the Danube was frozen. So all he did was break his legs when he landed. But that was an example of how brave she was. And she got into Poland over the mountains. And of course, she was given another Olympic skier as her guide. And what happened to them as they were crossing the mountains, she became his mistress. And that was the way her life went on. But she established a secret radio station. She smuggled out of Poland the plans and the actual object of a new experimental, very highly effective anti-tank gun. She organized a spy network. She crossed and recrossed Poland using whatever transport she could find, which included cars, very, very rarely, feet, very, very often, horse-drawn carriages most of the time, trains sometimes, and she had no hesitation about risking her life, and she always got away with it. And when eventually she was rumbled, and they knew that she was there, and she had to get out, she was driven. She got herself back to Hungary. Hungary was about to, become a place that was too dangerous for her. So the British ambassador in Hungary who was also in love with her, put her in the boot of his car. He said, folded like a penknife, very beautiful woman, folded like a penknife in the boot of the car, and he drove her to freedom. And afterwards, he said, Christine Granville. He said she's one of the most intrepid, brave people I've ever met, men or women. And he said Christine can do anything with dynamite except eat it. And that's the impression she made. She's a very valuable agent, and she wasn't used until after we'd invaded France, because people didn't really know how to. She languished in Cairo for quite a long time. Another woman was a one-legged American called Virginia Hall, who had worked after the invasion of France by the Germans. She worked in France driving ambulances. Being American, she wasn't at danger. She got herself to England and met Boddington and said, I want to go back to France. And he said, and Boddington, second in command of the SOE, known as the total shit, it was also, he'd had high-level Gestapo contacts before the war, and it's highly likely, and we'll never know the truth though, but it's highly likely that he was working for the Gestapo, and at one point he was parachuted into Paris himself. They knew he was there and they didn't arrest him, and to this day we don't know why. And just to finish that thought, the third in command of the SOE was a Romanian woman called Vera Atkins. She was quite scary, she was very aloof. What a Romanian was doing at the center of one of the most secret operations of the war, nobody knows, and she never wrote things down, and she destroyed everything just before she died. So with her died another secret. But Boddington, just going back to Virginia Hall, said, this is a very good idea. We'll send you into France as an accredited press representative of a New York newspaper. And they got her accreditation, and she was inserted by boat, I think, into the what was called the Free Zone of France, the Vichy France, where she began to write about conditions in France, and where she organized an enormous network. And she became the first woman agent, and she had been told, as others had been told, well, you probably won't be very good at doing any of this, but do your best. And she ended up, somebody said, by 1942, she was the most important agent in France. And if you went into Virginia Hall's kitchen, you would eventually meet all the important agents who were operating at the time. And she was absolutely selfless in her ability to organize things, or if she found somebody who was in trouble, an agent who was in trouble, she would even give them her own ration cards, do anything to help them. And in the end, she was rumbled. They knew that Germans knew that she was there, and they entered the Free Zone. And a man who was known as the Butcher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie, knew that Virginia Hall was operating, and she escaped literally minutes before he arrived. And he said, I will do anything to get hold of that American bitch. I mean, he actually called her a Canadian bitch because they'd not quite understood where she came from. But she then got out of France, having set up quite a lot of the infrastructure that would be necessary for us before the invasion of France. And the whole point of the SOE was to gather information, supervise the assembly of arms, and to get ready for sabotage activity in the days running up to D-Day.
Going through your book, Rick, but I got a feeling that, all these amazingly brave women, but their men colleagues and their superiors never really gave them the due recognition or respect that they deserved, almost patronizing them through through the time. In fact, not hiring them to begin with, thinking women won't be good enough in this job.
No, they always did. I mean, I've told you that Christine Skarbek, having done these amazing things in Poland, should have been sent immediately into France. She was sort of trilingual. She was left in Cairo. We don't know what to do with her. She's too dangerous. She's too willful. Virginia Hall, we don't really think she's going to be any good. Christine Skarbek, skipping forward to the end of the war, and she did something which, in fact, I'll tell you what she did now. At the end of after we'd invaded France, is it all right to do this now?
Yes, yeah. Please, yes. Certainly.
After we'd invaded France, the Allies began to move down through the country and then swinging east, heading for Germany. And then the Americans invaded the south of France. And sometime after the American invasion of the south of France, 3 key agents, one of whom, as you've guessed it, was Christine Granville's lover, she'd been his mistress, were arrested by the Gestapo. Christine heard this, and she was absolutely mortified that these guys were now in a Gestapo prison. And she said, I've got to get them out. And she bicycled to the prison. And she and this chap who's called Francis Commerz used to sing Frankie and Johnny together. So she stood outside the walls of the prison where there were lots of people milling around. And remember, the Americans are now 100 miles to the south. The town has been bombed. So there's quite a bit of chaos. But she stood outside it singing Frankie and Johnny. And she heard a voice from inside singing Frankie and Johnny, so she knew Frances was in there. And then the really brave bit happens, that she is an English SOE agent. She talks her way into the prison, into the head of the prison's office, who's an SS officer who appears in front of her in his full SS uniform, carrying a gun. And she says, "I am an SOE officer. You have 3 SOE officers in here. I want you to release them. What's more," I think she said, "I am Winston Churchill's niece. I am Field Marshal Montgomery's daughter." She span this tale. It was all complete rubbish, but she said it with such conviction, and she said it so often. And this man could have shot her at any moment. He put the gun down on the table and began to listen to her. And she said, "And if you don't release these men, you yourself will be arrested by the Americans, who are now only 100 miles south of here, and they will hang you. And if they don't get you, the resistance will hang you, and they'll torture you before they hang you." By the time she'd finished, 4 hours later, this man was trembling. He'd bought coffee in for her. He'd had coffee brought in. He couldn't hold the cup. He was trembling. And it was all his coffee was pouring in, running into the saucer. She had completely mentally dominated this man. And eventually he said, "Well, I want to be a British agent. I want to help you fight. If you'll forgive me, I'll come and work for you." And the men in the, whilst all this was happening, what Christy knew was the clock was ticking, because the men in the cell who had been captured were due to be executed at 9 o'clock that night. And a guard came into their room, marched them out, marched them up through the gates to a playing field where they knew normally the firing squad waited in the dark. And they looked to the left where the firing squad was meant to be, no firing squad. And they couldn't work out what was happening. And then they looked ahead, and there was a motor car, big powerful car, and in that big powerful car was the head of the Gestapo, the person that Christine Granville had bullied. And they were made to get in it, and they thought, well, now what's happening? We don't know. And then the car drove on in the rain, in the dark, and ahead of them they saw a black wall, and in front of the black wall, like a spy film, was a woman in a white trench coat, and it was Christine. And she got into the car and didn't speak to them, and they all pretended they didn't know each other, and they thought this really, they were so disoriented, they thought this really is the end of it all. We're going to be taken to Dachau or to some terrible place and executed. And then about 5 miles further down the line, the car stopped, the SS guy got out, he took all his uniform off and put civilian clothes off and said, "You're now free." And Christine turned round and grinned at them, and she had engineered that on her own, just with her own force of personality. And a British general, after the war, said that was the single bravest personal action of the war. That woman who'd been, allowed to not do her work while she was in Cairo, had done this, had released 3 top-level British agents from the very jaws of death. Now, you'd think after the war, they would say, "Christine, we're so grateful to you. You gave us your all." They didn't. She.
Yeah, this is what I was.
Well, let me read. Just let me read.
This remarkably brave woman, a Polish aristocrat, who goes on.
They said, "No. Christine Granville, no. We've got no further work for her." What does she mean? She wants a pension? Of course not. And I've seen this document. It said. This is written on a piece of paper, which is in the National Archive in London. She's no longer wanted. Unless we have any likely job in the offing, I suggest it would be simpler matter to arrange for her to resign her commission and go back to that civilian life from whence she came. No employment here. I mean, that's a bloke sitting in an office writing off the life of a woman who has been as brave as you can possibly be, who's up there with Noor, who's up there with Virginia Hall, who's up there with the other women I wrote about. And what happened to Christine was that she became very, very depressed. She began to work for a shipping line as a stewardess on the shipping line, and a steward another man fell in love with her. And he said, "I want to be your boyfriend." And she said, "No, you can't." And he got so obsessed with her that he stalked her, and one night he crept up behind her in her hotel in Kensington, which at that time was a very run-down bit of London, and stabbed her to death. And that's how we thanked Christine Granville. I mean, you could weep with the rage of it. Tell her to go back from whence she came. What English public school boy wrote that piece of drivel?
And they didn't even give her the British nationality, which she so wanted.
That's what when she
British
got it.
passport.
She did get it in the end, but I mean, she had to struggle and struggle and struggle for years. Gratitude should just have been to all of them. They should have said, "Don't worry. From now on, you'll have a pension. You'll live a wonderful life, or just a comfortable life, and that's our way of thanking you. That's our way of paying you back for what you've lost and what you've given."
So is it because they were women? I mean, is it that the
Well,
women
yes,
agents
it was
treated more?
I don't think I'm oversimplifying it, because the men had different things happen to them. They were given jobs, they were given commissions, they were more or less looked after, and they formed the Special Forces Club, which now has photographs of all those women in it. But the men sort of, like men do, club together, whereas the women. Well, now you go back, don't you? You go back and run you're going to be a wife now, aren't you? It doesn't matter that you've just led 6,000 maquisards against the Germans with machine guns and hand grenades. You just carry on now as the housewife, the pretty little woman that you're meant to be.
And even Noor, she was awarded the George Medal for her bravery afterwards. But even the write-up on her has several irregularities, discrepancies. They've not really written about her in the glowing terms that now you have, and
No.
other...
No, I mean, should we read the...
yeah, I'm sorry, she's showing us some paper that we were so absorbed in your stories.
Oh, 50, that's right.
Okay,
just to show you how this, on a personal level, how this all works, I'd like to read you the capture of Noor Khan and her attempted escape. Is that all right?
Please,
Yeah.
Yes. Fascinating.
I can find it. I've got it all marked out here. Oh, yeah. So Noor Khan has operated in Paris for 3 months. She's been followed a lot of the time. She's evaded capture just before the incident that I'm going to read to you. They've really closed in on her, and she's walking through the area near her home, and she knows that she's being followed, and she eludes the followers very carefully. What she doesn't know is that now in her apartment is a German Abwehr officer waiting to capture her. She thinks she left her apartment that morning. She thinks nobody knows about it, and he's called Kato. He's a German, Kato, and he's waiting for her. In the flat, Kato heard footsteps on the stairs outside and a key rattling in the lock. He crossed to the door and pressed himself against the wall. Noor pushed the door open and stepped into her room, which was just as she'd left it. She took a pace forward, the door slammed shut, and the huge figure of Kato grabbed her from behind. She burst free and flew at him, screaming, pulling his hair and clawing at his face, trying to blind him. She bit his finger, tearing the flesh. He pulled clear of her, blood running down his hand. He tried grabbing her wrists to handcuff her, but failed. Eventually, he managed to throw her yelling and hissing onto the sofa, pulled out his gun and told her to shut up and be still or he would shoot her. Noor spat at him. Kato edged towards the telephone, keeping the gun trained on her, then lifted the receiver and dialed Kiefer's number, and Kiefer is his boss in Gestapo headquarters. The officer listened to the panting agent's plea for assistance and heard Noor shouting in the background. He told Vogt, another agent, to get back to the Rue de la Faisanderie, where Noor was, and to take 3 men with him. Vogt and his crew drew up near Noor's apartment and walked quietly towards the building, trying not to draw attention to themselves. Inside, they ran up the stairs to Noor's room and found the door ajar. Pushing it open, they discovered the small woman sitting upright on the sofa, snarling at Kato, who was on the other side of the room with his gun trained on her. Blood dripped from his hand onto the front of his trousers. And these, by the way, in case you think I've made all this up, it's based on the evidence given by these men in reports and, interrogations after the war. Noor began to scream in anger, calling them filthy bosh and raging against the luck of being caught just before flying back to England. Vogt thought the young woman looked dangerous, like a cornered tigress. The big man overwhelmed her, handcuffed her, and took her downstairs to the car, which whisked her into captivity. They recovered the exercise book in which Noor wrote down all her messages, and the case and the wireless set hidden in it. They made sure that the flat was tidy, closed and locked the door, left the key in its hiding place, and went back to the Avenue Foch, hoping that no one had seen what had happened. Hans Kiefer was in a state of excitement as he waited for the arrival of his latest prisoner. One of his men was amazed that such a small woman, with the air of an innocent child, could be so important. Inside the building, Noor was frog-marched across the splendid hall and up the marble staircase, heading for Vogt's office on the 5th floor. They forced her to sit in a chair, shaking with rage and anger, while Vogt asked again and again who she was, who were her accomplices, and what she was doing in Paris. She answered, spitting at him, her eyes glittering in fury. "You know who I am and what I am doing. You have my radio set. I will tell you nothing. I have only one thing to ask you. Have me shot as quickly as possible." Vogt told her he was not going to shoot her and continued to question her. She refused to speak, and after an hour he gave up, deciding it was time to lock her in one of the 7 tiny cells along the corridor, converted from the old servants' quarters. He said he would talk to her more in the afternoon and led her to a cell. He was about to leave her in charge of the guards when she demanded to have a bath. Vogt shrugged and agreed. To keep an eye on her, the guards put a brick down to stop the door being closed. Noor screamed at them in another fit of fury, calling them pigs, and telling them that she was not going to undress in front of their filthy eyes. She got her way. As soon as the door was shut, she opened the bathroom window and pulled herself through the narrow opening. Below was a drop of 5 floors, with only a flimsy gutter to stand on. The roof sloped away above her head, and she held onto the tiles to keep her balance. To her right was a dormer window, which, if she could reach it, she could swing up onto and crawl over the roof to freedom. She began to move slowly, concentrating hard. Vogt decided to check up on what was happening. He found the guards outside the bathroom door. There was no sound but running water. Vogt went into the lavatory next door and looked out of the window. He found himself staring at Noor as she edged along the gutter towards his window. She was oblivious to his presence. Vogt let her get almost all the way to him, and then very quietly, so as not to startle her, he spoke, using the code name that he knew her by, Madeleine. "Madeleine, don't be silly. You will kill yourself. Think of your mother. Give me your hand." Noor stared at him for a second before grasping his outstretched hand and allowing herself to be hauled in through the window. Guards surrounded her and marched her sobbing to one of the 7 cells where they left her alone. So that was her, and it was ironic that he said he used the one thing that he knew would affect her. Think of your mother, because at that moment she could have allowed herself to drop, as some agents did, and died 5 stories down. But she didn't, and then that not falling, as she crawled back through the window, she crawled back into the terrible 9 months that would lead her to the end of her life. And I wonder if I can just go on, is that all right, to talk about what the end of her life was like. It's a harrowing story, and as I've said to you, she was kept chained to the floor in great misery, being beaten all the time. And then, as the Allies moved through France, Hitler ordered that all the SOE agents that were in captivity should be shot. And Noor was one of a group of 4, by now in a concentration camp, who were going to be shot that day. And 3 of them were shot, but Noor was taken aside and kept aside, and the German officer who was in charge of her was told, "Give the Creole," that's how they referred to her, "give the Creole the works." And we know this because he was interrogated once he was captured, and he too was hanged for what he did. But he said, by the time I'd finished with her, she was a bloody mess. And we don't know exactly what he meant by that, but we do know that he beat her up, he may have raped her. I mean, the appalling torment that she went through. is almost impossible to talk about. But when he finally pulled out his pistol, probably a Luger, to shoot her in the head, she said at the end of the torment, "Liberté." That was how strong her spirit was. And then bang, and she was dead, and her misery was over. Now, she must have thought that if she thought anything, that word would never echo beyond the stone walls of her prison, that was it, that her life had been in vain. But 2 years ago, I was at SOAS, London University, where from this subcontinent, a civil rights lawyer, a woman, gave the inaugural Noor Liberté lecture. And that was a very wonderful thing to be at, because what it shows, and I think this is one of the things that I'm personally picking up from this weekend, and I heard Professor Rogan talk about it, the way we defy oppression, the way we defy the strong governments that want to hurt us, is by doing things ourselves. We don't think, it's little me, what good is it, I'll just get on with my life and go shopping and not take a... Everything we do as individuals builds up into something that has meaning. And Noor Khan did that, and I feel, that in writing this book, that Noor has set me personally and us a very, very high moral barrier, moral standard to live up to. And that's what she did, and that's what her life means, and it's a wonderful thing. We've just had a 5-minute thing, and I'd like to, if anybody's got a question, but before I finish, I'd just like to read a poem that for me sums up it's an emotional poem. It was a poem given to one of the women agents as she was to use it to make her codes with. It was a sort of cryptographical device, but it is a poem that for me sums up emotionally what they did. So it's called The Life That I Have. And it goes, "The life that I have is all that I have. And the life that I have is yours. And the love that I have of the life that I have is yours and yours and yours. A sleep I shall have, a rest I shall have, yet death will be but a pause. For the peace of my years in the long green grass will be yours and yours and yours." And I think that's, thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Rick Stroud, you're not only a great writer, you're a great orator as well.
Thank you.
You've really brought Noor Khan to life amongst the rest of her other comrades.
Good, thank you.
Yes, please.
She was the daughter of Peer Inayat, who is the head of the Inayati spiritual order, which is recognized in this part of the world. And very recently I came to know that about 6 months ago, she has been given a sort of a spiritual status in the order, in the Inayati order. I forget the title, but because of all that she did as a spy, because of her high standard of honesty, and because the Inayati order spells compassion for everybody and a high standard of truth. That is why she has been given this title.
Oh, wow.
Good. Well, that's wonderful to hear. I mean, that's the sort of recognition she should have.
It's a very recent development, about 6 months ago.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. That's a very important information.
In fact, the spiritual representative, I should call her, of the Inayati order lives in Lahore. And I do go to her zikr sessions off and on. And she actually told us this.
That's very good to know, thank you.
And this was told to her by Noor's nephew, Peer Zia, who lives in Paris, I believe.
Oh, he still lives in
This
Paris.
is the
okay.
status. And I believe because of the status, her name is now included in the shajara of the spiritual order.
I see.
This
Good.
is
Thank
So
you.
she keeps getting honored even now,
he's
70 years
honoured-
after.
honoured.
A little
I think
after
her
the
memory
war.
now is stronger than it has been. There's what you've just said, which is wonderful to hear. There is a statue in London. There is these lectures I told you about are going on annually, and so her name is repeated. But as I've tried to say, that it's the moral standard that she set that is so important. The way she stood up to the fiercest oppression.
And I have to also add that the books that are being written by Western authors that have really brought her back to life, even on the subcontinent. I don't think we really ever had much knowledge of her life or her sacrifice before that. Yes, please.
Oh, sorry. No, you don't. So, this lady here, sorry.
Actually, one is just a question, because recently her statue has been put up in London.
It was, yes.
Yeah, and that's just that there's this recognition. I think that was done a lot in terms of the women's movement, insisting that this part of history, as it's done with many others, women who have played a role. The other is you're mentioning that film, Carve Her Name with Pride. I saw it when I was young, very young, and that and another film called Sing No Sad Songs for Me.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And these two, sort of, I've romanticized them all my life, and I always said that these are the two whom I'll have to live. This becomes a standard of commitment and bravery, etc., and they sort of travel with me. Now, are you telling me Carve Her Name with Pride is...
Can we just take,
not-
sorry, another question?
Yes, I am. It's a romanticization of what happened. Did that lady there want to ask?
Sorry, Victoria, you want-
yeah,
yes,
just
please.
last question. I think we've been told it's time to...
Thank you very much, Rick. I just thought that was so moving. Interestingly, I knew about Noor as a child because that very first book my mother had, and I remember her weeping when she read it, you know, the first book that was ever written about her. I wanted
Yes.
to ask you about Matilda and those women who got turned. Is there any evidence that they ever tried to sort of do a double thing and not actually lead the Germans? It seems she just delivered everybody up on a plate immediately.
The story is too complicated, but she was eventually taken to London. She was sort of kidnapped by various things. And the Germans hoped that she would become a double agent working for us. And in fact, she was one way or another interrogated for 6 weeks, and then she was, and kept very comfortably, and then she was arrested, put in Brixton prison and kept there for the end of the war. And at the end of the war, she was tried in Paris and condemned to death. That was commuted to life imprisonment, and she eventually got out blind and disillusioned. But there weren't that many German agents operating. In fact, there were none. We turned all of them. It was what we weren't good at was dealing with the with
Buckmaster
the Germans.
seems absolutely hopeless. At what point did they know that that the reception committee had been compromised?
They never acknowledged it, and after the war, I mean, never. And the last thing I'll say is that when Buckmaster went back to civilian life, he became something like chairman of the Advertising Standards Authority, and I knew somebody who worked with him, and they said he was so useless that we fired him. So finito.
How
I'm afraid
depressing.
we're over.
Thank you.
Sorry, that's not...
Rick, thank you again.
Thank you very much.